Hello, and welcome to this month's virtual parlor chat from the Morris-Jumel Mansion. My name is Catherine Hughes, and I'm the Executive Director of the Morris-Jumel Mansion. I will be facilitating this evening's parlor chat, while our Manager of Public Programs and Visitor Services, Maddie Mungo, is behind the scenes running tech. First, a little bit about the Morris-Jumel Mansion. It was built in 1765 and is the oldest residence in Manhattan. It was the war headquarters for George Washington, but it was built as a summer home by British Colonel Roger Morris and his wife, Mary Phillips Morris. The mansion would later go on to house the enigmatic Eliza Jumel, Vice President Aaron Burr, and the chef Ann Northup. In addition to being an important part of New York City and American history, the mansion is active as a community arts resource for the dynamic neighborhoods of Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood. We offer a diverse array of educational programming in the arts, history, and historic preservation for a wide audience of local, national, and international visitors. We hope Morris-Jumel Mansion's virtual parlor provides for stimulating conversation, while attendees can enjoy a coffee or aperitif of their choosing from the comfort of their home. Morris-Jumel Mansion hosts this series of online chats with a variety of experts to discuss topics that explore the history of the mansion, the area, New York City, and connect these to the present day. The virtual parlor chat series is held on Zoom every third Wednesday of the month at 7 p.m. In the parlor chat format, we give the first half of the program to our presenter to share, and the second part is moderated with a Q&A by myself as the facilitator and with our speaker and you, the virtual audience. If you have a question, you can go ahead and put it in the Q&A. We'll collect these and we can answer the question right away, or we can save it for after the presentation. All parlor chats are recorded and can be viewed by visiting the Morris-Jumel Mansion's YouTube page. This month, we are excited to have Ramin Ganeshram with us to talk about the development of Morris-Jumel's new permanent exhibit, Life Below Stairs. Ramin is an award-winning journalist and historian who is currently the executive director of the Westport Museum for History and Culture. Her area of study is colonial-era African-American history, focused on enslaved African-Americans and mixed-race people. Ramin spent 10 years researching and writing The General's Cook. This is her book about the chef enslaved by George Washington. The research process continued after the novel was published, leading her to discover the post-emancipation fate of Hercules, solving a 218-year-old mystery. Ramin has been recognized for evolving the 131-year-old Westport Museum toward an inclusive interpretation of local history as part of the larger American story by focusing on race, ethnicity, and gender. She is the recipient of a New England Museum Association Award of Excellence, Leadership in the Museum Field. Ganeshram was Paul Cuffey Memorial Fellow for the study of minorities in American maritime history at Mystic Seaport, and is currently a fellow at the Fred W. Smith Library for the study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. A professionally trained chef and award-winning journalist and food writer, Ramin has contributed to major national and international publications. She is an alumna of Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism and the author or co-author of 8 cookbooks and 2 food-centered novels. I'm excited to hear Ramin talk about the project Life Below Stairs, and I know that you, the audience, are too. So please let me now turn the program over to her. Welcome, Ramin.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm happy to be here. So what I'm going to talk to everybody about this evening is how, as a team, we went about reinterpreting the kitchen at the mansion. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar, the reason it's called Life Below Stairs is because the kitchen is, in fact, at the basement level of the mansion. This was actually quite common in houses of Dutch origin, even though the builder Roger Morris was English. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's also a term that is often that is used to refer to those who work in a household, either as free labor, servants, or enslaved people. Next slide, please. Okay, so in talking about, I think you have to click it again to see the text. No, back. I think there's text missing from here. Okay. So in talking about the kitchen, what we really needed to think about was a couple of things. How was the space used? Who was there? Essentially, what was the life of the house? What was the context, right? So this particular house was interesting because it was a private residence. As Catherine said, it was used as a headquarters site, actually not just for George Washington. And I'm going to give you a little context on that for those of you who don't know. I know many of you probably do because you are history buffs, but essentially in the summer of 1776 was the only time the Continental Army and George Washington occupied New York City during the Revolutionary War. That culminated in the Battle of Long Island, sometimes called the Battle of Brooklyn, at which point, after the end of that altercation, Washington retreated up to what is today Washington Heights and set up shop, took possession in the abandoned Morris Mansion in what was called in Harlem Heights. It was the only house in the area, pretty much. There were some other small farmhouses. It had several hundred acres associated with it, and it had broad vistas from river to river. After Washington left the Morris Mansion in October of 1776, it was then occupied as the British headquarters to the end of the war by Lieutenant General Henry Clinton. So when we talk about the house, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the history later. We really need to think about all the ways in which this building was used, right? Who was there? So it was a residence, it was a military headquarters, and it was at one point a tavern. So it had multiple uses. So who was there? We need to really think about, the way we chose to do this was to think about the labor in the house, meaning the enslaved servants, the free servants, and the indentured. There may have been indentured white servants in the house as well. It was a very common practice at the time, and how they used this kitchen space. So this is a little bit of a different approach than kitchen spaces had been interpreted very traditionally in the past in house museums. In the past, these spaces were often interpreted through the material culture around which that was present in the space. So what do I mean by that? I mean bowls, cooking utensils. It could even include textiles, really the things that went into producing a meal, the furniture, the space. And these are important, absolutely, but they're only important in as much as who used them. What skill level somebody had to have to be able to make use of some of these more complex items, right? So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. A conversation that we had when we were doing this work was whether or not this kitchen had something called a spit jack or a clock jack, which was a mechanism that hung essentially from the ceiling, and it had a clock-like mechanism of dials. It was mechanical, and it was hooked to a spit, and it regularly turned a spit holding a joint of meat or a small animal. The large ones actually could turn a spit holding a much larger animal like a boar or a pig. And it freed up a cook to do something else. But this was a piece of mechanical equipment. It had to be kept in good working order. Not every house had it. They were extraordinarily expensive. We didn't find evidence necessarily of this being in this house, but because of the wealth of the owners, it well could have been. I'm telling you this as an example and thinking about the world at large, the context where of this house, the people who built it, and therefore built it, used it, and therefore the skill level of the people who had to work in the kitchen. Next slide, please. Nope, yeah. So when we start to think about this, we really had to think about the plan going forward to interpret this kitchen. There were challenges, right? The challenges really lie in a couple of things. So the first is that there are not a lot of extant records. In fact, there are no extant records, such as account ledgers and so on, relating to the Morris's time in this house. There's very minimal primary source material. We were able to find a lot of what was out there, but a lot of what is out there is not much. But more than that, if we're talking about who labored in that kitchen, the truth of the matter is that it's quite difficult to build a world around people who really do not show up in the historic record, except as property, except as commerce, right? Except as transactional. So we need to really think about how we were going to do that. So the plan that we had, given the challenges that we had that I just described to you, was to reconstruct the space physically. How can we make the space seem, if not 100% like it might have been, but enough so that you could get a real taste of it. We're fortunate in that the original hearth is there, the original floor is there. The lower level has been reconstructed so that the entirety of the basement spaces that would have been used, including a larder, a food storage area, and a laundry, a place to wash clothes, is not available. Those spaces have been reused in the modern sense. So that part of it wasn't available to be seen. How do we reconstruct the space then to make it to feel as authentic as possible, knowing that we're hindered by, in some cases, the space itself, but also the modern need for this space, which is programming. Programming takes place in this kitchen. So how can we really tell the story in the fullest way possible with giving the staff the opportunity to make use of it? The plan was also to bring, BIPOC cooks to life, particularly the enslaved African cooks who were in this space, as well as free cooks of color like Anne Northrop. How can we do that? Through material culture, but through other ways as well. So one of the things that we chose to do certainly was wherever we could story tell around the people that we knew, we did that. But part of that was building a world for them. These are people who existed in a larger world. Their whole identity was not being enslaved or even being a cook or living in this house, even for a short period of time. They had identities over and above this, just like we all do, right? As members of families, as members of their societies. So what we wanted to do was bring them to life, not just describing their considerable skill, and it was considerable skill to work in a house of this kind, and to use the diverse nature of food that was available to them, which I'll talk about shortly, but to really talk about the larger context in which they existed. This is incredibly important, right? So what was their community? How could they have interacted with one another within the context of working? How might they have perceived the larger world just because of the current events around them? So we can't know what anybody in the time thought unless they wrote down those thoughts, but we can talk about what were the current events. What were the big factors that if you lived in this time, you knew about, and certainly influence kind of your worldview. So that was the plan, reconstruct the space so that it was authentic but usable in the modern sense, bring these cooks to life by demonstrating their skill and demonstrating the diversity of foods that they had available to them, which was actually quite vast, spanning not just what was available locally, but imports from the Caribbean, imports from Europe, and so on, and their ability to use all these foods, and then to build a world around them that extended outside of the walls of the mansion and outside of the walls of that kitchen. Next slide, please. So there was a lot of challenges, right? There's always challenges when we talk about difficult histories like this. First of all, because of, as I had explained earlier, particularly enslaved people, but not just enslaved people, even free people of color, they do not appear very fully in the historical record the way their white or European counterparts do, right? So there's a lot of gaps in the historical record. In this case of this particular site and this particular house, interestingly, the gaps in the historical record also do relate to the white family that built the house. And the reason is they were loyalists. And so being on the wrong side of the American Revolution, a lot of their records have been lost. They went back to England. Their property was confiscated formally by an act of the New York legislature in 1779. And so a lot of things are missing, but on really kind of both sides of this coin. Another aspect that was a challenge that we really wanted to get across was educating about about enslavement in the North, right? So this is a very misunderstood concept. People often will say to me at my site, which is in Westport, Connecticut, but it wasn't as bad as in the South. Isn't that correct? And it is not correct. It was just different. It was equally as bad. The taking of someone's liberty and living under fear and terror of bodily harm at any given moment, because the law says that can happen as a punishment to an enslaved person in that period of time, is not better. It's not better. It's just different in that in the North, enslaved people often lived within the household with their enslaver, right? So let's use the mansion as an example. The individuals in this house were not living in a house or a barrack or a cabin outside of the property. They were perhaps sleeping in the kitchen if they worked in the kitchen, or sleeping in a hallway if they were a lady's maid or a valet or a maid or a man of all work, meaning they needed to be available to do any task that was needed. So it was actually a much closer proximity in many ways, very much not outside of the watchful eye of the enslaver. And yet they managed to function under these conditions. So to me, that speaks to a real strength of spirit, a real strength of will, a bravery, in incredibly, incredibly horrific and difficult circumstances. So educating about Northern slavery, how it played out in New York, what it meant, was a big part of the challenge. How can we elegantly imbue the story of the kitchen and those who work there in line with educating the public about enslavement in the North? And then, as I said earlier, making the space usable for programming, particularly school groups. How can we tell all of these stories and make all of this information as accessible as possible while keeping the space accessible to be moved around, to have hands-on or other types of programming, particularly for school groups. Next slide, please. Okay, so the factors we had to consider when we were starting this project was, as I alluded to, when and how the space was used, right? So as I mentioned, it was built, or as Catherine first mentioned, it was built as a private house. What you should know is that it wasn't the primary residence of the Morris family. It was actually more like a summer house or a country house. They lived downtown in Stone Street, right? So they didn't spend a lot of time in this house. Why does that matter in terms of the kitchen? It matters because it's very possible that there wasn't the amount of staff in the household when they were in residence, not like their main house. We don't know, because we don't have their records, if that was the case, but it certainly adds it to the realm of possibility. They simply did not spend enough time here, given the nature of the house. Then also one of the things that we had, and as I mentioned, it was used as then a headquarters for both the Patriots and the Loyalists. And then it was a tavern for a period of time. It was actually a tavern twice. First in the 1780s, after it was confiscated, purchased, and then rented by a man named Talmadge Hall, who ran a tavern / stagecoach stop called Calumet Hall from the house. So there was 2 stagecoaches, one that went to upstate New York and one that essentially just only went to Westchester, that ran from the house. And he developed it as a hotel of sorts, right? So you could stop for the day. It was said to be the first tavern outside of the city limits, being, by the way, at that time, the city limits in the 1780s was still essentially below Canal Street, right? So it was quite a way. We all know what that distance is. Imagine covering it in a carriage. It takes maybe, I think it probably took about 45 minutes or an hour at the time before you saw this tavern that had been the Roger Morris house, as it was called. Interestingly enough, when you look at advertisements, which is one of the ways that we reconstructed a lot of what happened for this building from, 1779 all the way up into probably 1810, before the Jumels took it over, it remained being referred to as the Morris House, or Colonel Morris's country seat, or Roger Morris's house in Harlem Heights. So it was consistently referred to that. And then of course it became a private residence again. But the how of how the building was used is really important for us to understand how to then interpret this kitchen. Whereas the Morrises may not have had a lot of staff working there, by the time it was a hotel and a tavern, there probably were a lot of people working there because there was a lot of people coming through the building. And the other thing we wanted to consider was cultural affiliations of the owners. And I should say also the people who labored there, right? That's more difficult to put together. But one thing we do know, cultural affiliations of the owners, that Roger Morris, as I mentioned, was English, but his wife, Mary Phillips Morris, was of Dutch descent, born in the United States, effectively English by this time, by culture, but from a very powerful, probably the most powerful Dutch trader family in New York, granted the largest land grant in New York State, and they made their money on the Atlantic trade. So the piece of property upon which this house was built was a lot that was part of a inheritance of Mary Phillips. Next slide, please. So the next factor that we had to think about was the space itself. And the first thing was drawing the right comparison. So you might say a kitchen is a kitchen, or you could look at any 18th century or colonial kitchen and draw inferences to another one. And that is not exactly true, because kitchens in the South, for example, might have been entirely in a different room in a cookhouse. In other parts of the English colonies, the kitchen may not be in a basement. So there was that Dutch and English comparison. So what you see at the top left is actually a picture of it's actually now being reinterpreted as well, John Jay House in Westchester. And you can see through the window, this is a first floor kitchen. The Jay family, also being quite prominent, but this is a first floor kitchen. It's not in the basement. But there are other things that we could take inference from, especially, knowing kind of what the workspace was for a typical 18th century kitchen, was that one thing that we have in our kitchens that are not, we're not in 18th century kitchens. And I'd ask you, I don't know if anyone wants to answer in the chat, any guess outside the obvious, which is electronics, but do we all have in our kitchens, which none of these kitchens had? Yeah. Yeah. Catherine, I can't hear you. Or do you have an idea?
Sorry, I muted myself. Oh, we have somebody raising their hand, so we're gonna
Okay.
have her suggest it. Maddie, can we let Susan well, Susan, write it in the chat and we'll have your answer. Water.
So that's a really, really good thought. And the fact is that's not always the case, right? Because some kitchens did have a well right in the kitchen. In fact, this kitchen in the Morris Mansion, the Morris-Jumel Mansion, did have running water in the kitchen. There was a spring under the house. There was a pump and a well right in that kitchen. And that, if you were lucky enough to have that kind of property and site your house nicely and smartly, you could have running water. Now it's something else. Does anyone have an idea? Catherine, you have an idea? I see there's.
Refrigerator.
Well, that's true. There was no electric refrigerator.
Well, maybe what Lauren means is just no way to keep something cool.
Yeah, so that also depended, right? So depending on how a house was sited, like in the Morris-Jumel Mansion, there was a larder. And it was, again, it's the basement, right? So because it's below grade, it was cooler. I mean, certainly not like a refrigerator like we have now, but it was cooler. So they had a better chance of keeping things cool than in other kitchen sites. Somebody said it didn't have seating. So no, it did have seating, but what would happen was that the seating was often bench seating. Not always. There's, chair back seating too, ladder, just regular chairs. But the seating had to be movable, right? It had to be movable against walls, movable out of the way, so that the amount of work that took place in a kitchen could take place. So I'm going to tell you guys the answer. The answer is built-in cabinetry. These kitchens did not have cabinets the way our kitchens have cabinets that are built into a wall. So they handle storage by cabinets, or what was often called a dresser, a kitchen dresser. So in that picture of the J kitchen, you see that's kind of sideboard with shelves. It's also called a hutch, right, in the modern sense. But this was called a kitchen dresser. And these dressers and cabinets for a kitchen were very extant in 18th century kitchens. The Dutch tended to have very large, heavy cabinets, almost like the one you see on the right there in the top left picture, as storage. And it could be for dishes, it could be for spices, it could be for linens, all the things that you might need in a kitchen. So really part of this process was looking at different kitchens in different places and determining, based on the wealth, relative wealth of the owner as compared to the Morrises, the size of the home as compared to the Morris-Jumel Mansion, the period in which it was built as compared to the mansion, whether it was in the north, the south, or some interstitial place like the mid-Atlantic states, and determine what can we draw as possible and probable comparisons as to what would have been in this kitchen. And this is really for the what we call the furnishing of the kitchen. And so when we say the furnishing, we don't mean just literal furniture. We mean the pots, the pans, the candles, the baskets, the barrels, the storage containers, everything that you would need to create a completed kitchen. And then the last thing that we really kind of spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about, and interestingly, Saturday when we had the opening, one of your trustees, Catherine, said something to me that basically shed light on a question that I kept asking. And that is, when you think about the evolution of this building, of being in almost near continuous use from its time of its building in the 1760s, why didn't the kitchen evolve? And so from my perspective, I don't mean why wasn't it turned into a 20th century or 21st century kitchen? But why wasn't there a hole in the chimney for a cast iron stove? So there's that period of time between 15 and 20 years into the Jumel residency when a hearth would no longer have been used. Certainly by the time of Anne Northup, a cast iron stove, starting with a smaller Franklin stove and then all the way up to the big cast iron stoves that we all, I think, kind of recognize as being a late 19th century construct. Where was it? Why wasn't it there? And usually how that was affected was a hole was punched right into the hearth, kind of like where the mantle would be, for the stovepipe stack to go into the chimney and flue out, right? And so this didn't have that. And it didn't seem to have ever had that, from whatever extant material that we could find once this was refurbished into the 18th century style. So at this event last Saturday night, one of the trustees had mentioned to me that there was evidence that there was, at some point in the 19th century, possibly in Madame Jumel's time, an exterior kitchen built off of what is the octagonal room, and just accessible through a hallway. And that is probably then, if that is true, where that cast iron stove would have been. And then perhaps the basement at that point might have been storage, right? I have to admit, we didn't dive deeply into that, but we did have to consider the evolutions of the space, including what could have been taken away as time passed for the making this a usable space for the purpose of the people who lived in the house. Next slide, please. Okay, so then we were really thinking about the people. And so from our perspective here, and actually, so my focus is, the enslaved and free people of color working in these spaces, and particularly cooks, right? My focus is very much on cooks. So for me, it really was interpreting the space through the people who labored here, who brought their skill into the space, who honestly were at the forefront of major movements of history, but are unrecognized because of their status in the time and the lack of real full historical record about them. And so it's essentially almost like archaeology, where you are, sifting through layers and layers and layers and hoping for the tiniest shard of information. And that is essentially kind of, to some extent, what we did in order to interpret these particular people. So the first is Martha Morris. So Martha Morris, we presume, might have been an enslaved person owned by the Morris family. Certainly we know that she was Black. She worked as a laundress, at least in the period of time when Washington lived in the house as a headquarters, which was only about shy of 2 months, as I said, in the fall of 1776. I say presumed, or at least she was a laundress in that period of time. I want you to understand that the American Revolution, we like to think of it, or it's taught to us, as a very sort of a straight line series of events, very singular and kind of just kind of stamps on a timeline. And that, of course, is not what happened, right? It was a very chaotic time. There was economic recession because of the war. If lower down in the city itself, there had been a devastating fire right after the Battle of Long Island, and it wasn't rebuilt actually throughout the entirety of the war. Things were very difficult. So if the Morris family had kind of abandoned that house, or they weren't living there at the time, all this had happened and they never went back, what might have happened to an enslaved person who was up there? Could they have said to Martha, well, you stay here and watch the house? We don't know, right? We also don't know what Martha's real work, meaning the work she was trained to do. It is very possible she was trained to be a laundress. So I just want to explain to you, I want to digress a minute and explain to you how enslaved people particularly came into the labor that they were forced to do. And the way this happened is generally by the time an enslaved person was about 9, 10, 11 years old, they were given and this was more in the South in a very formal way, but certainly it also happened in the North, were given a work assignment, for lack of a better way to put it, right? Where it was decided what this person's work would be. Where they be an apprentice to another cook in the house. Apprenticeship for cooks was a very normal and traditional way of learning to cook, even in Europe, all the way back to ancient Rome. Even today, I went to culinary school. An obligation of that course of study was that you go and you work as an apprentice cook in a restaurant or with another chef. This is kind of how you learned, right? If in fact a laundress was needed, a young person, as I said, as young as 10 or 11, might be sent to the laundry to learn how to launder clothes from an older person. And the same thing with a blacksmith or a cooper or a gardener or a groomsman and so on, right? So is it not unlikely that Martha Morris was a laundress in actual fact? That was the work she was trained to do. It's probably right, but we do not know for sure. But what we do know is that there was a receipt from Martha, given to Martha for the payment of laundering clothes for General Washington. So I was able to go into Washington's Revolutionary account ledgers and confirm that, in fact, he was paying her many more times than that receipt actually indicated. It's a receipt for one event, but there were multiple entries of paying Martha Morris to launder clothes. And in this period of time, receipts, ledgers, account books, when enslaved people or Black people or Indian people, indigenous people, anybody who essentially wasn't European was in a ledger book, it was very, very, very common to indicate their race, to say that the person was Black, African descent, Indian, and so on, right? So that's how we know it was Martha Morris, but that's how we know she was Black. Hannah and Isaac Till. Hannah and Isaac Till were a couple they were cooks. She actually was partially of indigenous descent from Pennsylvania originally. She and her husband, Isaac, were owned by a minister in New York City who rented them to George Washington as cooks during the course of the Revolution. They were with him during the entire Revolutionary War, cooking for his family, which is what he referred to as his aides de camp and his generals and sort of the senior officers. And they ate together every single night. They ate a multi-course meal. I was just saying to somebody here, I happen to be at Mount Vernon right now, and I was just saying to somebody here how he didn't really deviate much from his very fine and fancy meals, even when he was at war. He still had cooks to give him these multi-course meals, very fine food, imports from around the world. He had his Madeira. I'm telling you this to say that Hannah and Isaac Till are referred to as camp cooks, but they weren't really camp cooks. They weren't cooking, kind of rough food over an open fire. They were still producing very elegant meals for Washington and his staff in a kitchen, like in the Morris-Jumel Mansion when they were there for 2 months. Another person that those records indicated was there present was a woman named Mrs. Thomas. And she, in fact, was the housekeeper. So he had a housekeeper traveling with him to manage these headquarter homes where he set up. And if you remember, I talked about the context of how the house was used. Someone asked me again at that evening, how many people would have been in this house? The answer is it depends. But during the Revolutionary War, during those 2 months, and then later when General Clinton had it as well, the house would have been packed to the rafters with senior staff and aides de camp. Men would probably have been sleeping, in the attic, in the hall, on the floor of the halls, packed into rooms, because they were quite large staffs of people. Mrs. Thomas, for General Washington, managed the household. She was free. She was a free person of color. We know this about her. So we know her presence because of the payments and the ledgers. We know that she was free because some years later, William Lee, a very famous name, some of you may know, who was Washington's valet, what was called a body servant. You should know, I think until very recently, the man who attends the President of the United States was still called a body servant after William Lee. William Lee was, of course, always with Washington. He was in the house. Well, during that time, they formed an association sometime during this period of time, and they they married. And Washington actually wrote to a friend in Philadelphia. This was in the 1790s or 1780s, I think. I'm sorry, I don't remember the date off the top of my head, but certainly more than 10 or 15 years later, saying that William Lee has formed an attachment. He says he's married to Mrs. Thomas and would like for her to come to Philadelphia. Washington was against it. He didn't like that, but he did nonetheless send for her. We don't know what happened. We don't know if she ever, in fact, arrived at Mount Vernon. So these are some of the people that we wanted to interpret. We have a woman who is not really part of Washington's retinue, possibly had worked for the Morris family, and is now working and trying to make her way in this really chaotic time. Hannah and Isaac Till, extremely skilled cooks, working in a household that was actually quite formal, right? There's a housekeeper, there's a valet, and there are these two cooks. So we really wanted to talk about their experiences. Next slide, please. So what about the people who either employed them? In the case of Mrs. Thomas and Martha, they were employed. Later, Anne Northrop was employed by Madame Jumel, or enslavers, right? So in the case of the Tills, in the case of William Lee, Washington enslaved William Lee, and he enslaved by proxy Hannah and Isaac Till by renting them from their enslaver. You know, who were they, right? So they were clearly very elite people. They were elite white society. What was their interaction with these people who labored on their behalf? Well, the thing is, it was a close relationship, and I don't mean close as in affectionate and kind. We have no way of knowing that. And in fact, to enslave someone, it's not kind. It really doesn't matter what kind of frame you put around it. When I say close, I mean intimate, right? You can't live in a household with somebody, even a house as large as that one, and not be in close proximity to people, particularly in this period of time. In the time of Mary Phillips Morris, she would have been interacting with her cooks, whosoever they were in that house. She would have been coming downstairs and speaking to them. She would have been talking to them about the meal she expected, and so on. She would have been talking about, as Washington's provisioners were talking about, what was wanted from local farmers, what to purchase, what to buy at a market, what to have sent from elsewhere, right? So they were very much part of the interaction, and it really wasn't quite an upstairs, downstairs type of an idea where there was kind of these two worlds and they don't meet. Actually, they were colliding all the time in service of producing these meals and the work that went on in the kitchen. The kitchen in the mansion also had a laundry, as I mentioned, so that also added another layer of people coming and going and interacting, particularly during the war. Next slide, please. Okay, so really quickly, because I think we're getting over time here, the food, right? So what were people cooking? How do we reconstruct this idea? So again, this is about world building. This is about understanding what was available. By the time this house was built, and certainly, by the time of the Revolutionary War, the Atlantic trade was a very well-entrenched institution. It was over a century of imports from Europe, from the Caribbean, the coastwise trade. And what do I mean by that? I mean trade up and down the coast, the East Coast, to bring rice from the Carolinas, to bring, goods from, apples from New York down to Philadelphia. Food was moving back and forth up and down the coast. So there was a variety, a very large variety. Foodways knowledge directly from Africa, and more often via the Caribbean, right? From West Africa to the Caribbean, back up here, was very common. In those days, the Caribbean was a very close in place. It's not like now, right? People moved back and forth between the Caribbean and the West Indies constantly to do business. And so the understanding and the trade of the foodways and the goods and the ingredients was very, very common. So this meant that these cooks had to learn a variety of cooking techniques, European, African, probably some indigenous, use a variety of ingredients from around the world. What they were not cooking, I just want to be clear, until the time of the Jumels, was French food, right? People think that they were cooking this kind of high level French food like Jefferson was doing at Monticello. They were not, but that doesn't mean that they weren't cooking very elaborate dishes. It's very likely and perhaps possible that Mary Philipps was having some Dutch items still made, passed on through her family, as we all have items from our ancestors and our families that we still make, even if the cultural connection isn't that tight anymore. So we wanted to demonstrate that in the text panels and in the fake food examples. Next slide, please. So just to kind of summarize, in building the world using, the food examples, we have a timeline of what a day in the life of a cook was, to understand all the different things that they had to do, and therefore all the different people they had to interact with to do their job. What we wanted to present and what we learned, what we showed was that it's a diverse world, right? Black, white, Lenape, people who are mixed race, and so on. It was international. We see that in the food. We also see that in the nature of the people who came and went, right? After Clinton abandoned the house as a headquarters, a Hessian general used the house as a headquarters. It was suburban, if not rural. It was truly the country at this time, as I explained. It was both contained within the house. The house was a whole world in and of itself. But it was also expansive because a war was going on. Later, the nation building of America was going on. There were a lot of things going on around these people that would have absolutely influenced who they were and what they understood. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the sources that we use. So some of the sources that were the most valuable were actually advertisements for the rental of the house or the sale of the house, right? So one of the advertisements gave us a lot of detail about the food actually that was available. The house had orchards all the way around it, very close to the actual building. Peaches, apricots, pears, gooseberries, cherries, currants, strawberries. There was a spring discovered at the house in the, I want to say, early in the war. A freshwater spring was discovered very close by the house, and that became a sort of item in the newspapers. So there was an availability of fresh water. So these advertisements were really interesting. One of the things, it also told us the layout of the house. There was a kitchen, a laundry, a wine cellar, storeroom, kitchen, pantry, sleeping apartments. So this is quite interesting. The kitchen had sleeping apartments, meaning that the senior people who worked below stairs had a little bit of a separate place to sleep. Highly unusual, right? Privacy as we know it today was not the same in the 18th century. That's certainly not as available for enslaved people. There was a dairy, so a room that they could churn butter and store it with cheese. And also it talks about the floor is rock, right? It's made of brick or it's made of stone, which to their mind made it a cleaner space, a space much easier to clean, unlike wood, right? It was probably more safe for fires as well. Here's a little interesting fact that we found. It doesn't relate to the kitchen, but to the point of the value of these newspaper items from the day. The house had a lightning rod in the 1700s, which was a very new innovation, right? Remember, our friend Franklin had only just recently before that discovered with his key and his kite, the idea of conducting electricity in that way. But so this house had a lightning rod. That's actually a valuable piece of information, although kind of esoteric. It tells us that the builder spared no expense in putting this house together. So the kitchen would not have been any less well appointed than other parts of the house. As I said, similar kitchens gave us a lot of clues, and account books, not that they were extant for this family, but for General Washington, certainly that was very helpful because in these account books, he talks about what he purchased. potatoes from this farmer and cabbages from that one, fish from somebody else. So we kind of understood what was going on in the larger world and then coming into the kitchen. And then probate documents. So one of the things I did was I asked a contact in England to get me Roger Morris's probate in England. So a probate inventory lists every single thing you owned in that period of time. So it was about making a comparison. People don't really radically change unless their fortunes really change, in terms of the things they want around them and the things they use every day. And then the last thing that I want to mention that I don't have in the bullet points was kind of really understanding again, sort of what was going on in the individuals' lives in as much as we could. So Roger Morris actually worked as the inspector of refugees from 1779 in occupied New York, meaning he was appointed, he was a retired military man, he was a colonel, he was appointed to hear the case of people, loyalists who had lost what they owned during the war and were petitioning the British government for help. And that was a job he did. And he then wrote a letter petitioning for help himself. So we kind of understood, his fortunes in that period of time before he returned to England. So that's kind of how we did it and what we were thinking. Yes, Catherine.
Can I just point out one of my favorite things in this advertisement is the octagon room is very happily calculated for a turtle party.
For a turtle party, meaning a party for turtle soup. Yeah, exactly.
I love that one.
Yeah, no, they're great. These ads were these were the find of the to me, I feel like this was one of our best finds.
Yeah, that it was exciting to find them. But I'm sorry if I interrupted at the beginning of your talk, but we're gonna grab a couple of questions from people now. And one of the things that I think really strikes me with the mansion is that it was so many different levels of life, so many different times that happened in the house. And so, how can we give voice to the many different people that worked in it, and I mean, it's just a special challenge in our house. So I mean, I'm just saying that because it's always a question of what we talk about. So now please put your Q&A, your questions, your Q, we'll do the A, into the Q&A function rather than the chat. And Ramin can answer those questions for you. Let's see.
I think, I just, while we're waiting for people to, if they do have questions to ask them, one of the things that I just want to point out that was really important for all of us when we were doing this work was really to allow particularly the cooks the ability to step forward from the shadows by building a whole world around them. Even though there isn't a lot of information extant about them personally in the historic record, we really wanted to give them the opportunity to step forward by using whatever was at our disposal, because understand that these were people who were very close proximity to key events in American history. The war, the nation building, ideas of wealth, freedom, and so on. And they don't get their due, and they should. So, I mean, to feed the man who was tasked with an entire revolution is quite a task, and especially when you do it under duress.
Right. Well, we do have a question, why didn't we pick one year and interpret that moment in time?
Yeah, so I mean, I think so that's a great question. And I think I mean, I can't really speak for the mansion staff. I can tell you that from my perspective, really so much of the story, it was very hard to say what should you let go? Like all of it is so important, kind of for the reasons that I mentioned, right? Like at every and almost every aspect of this kitchen's life, this mansion's life, it was very much at the center of major events in American history. And it felt like to leave one out or part of them out was doing a disservice to the visitor, right? Because history isn't static, right? It's an evolutionary thing. And history is, this is a pinpoint. I think about your own life. A million things are going on, right? There are wars going on. There's stuff in your family. There's stuff at your job. You went to a nice dinner. You had an argument with your friend. You just bought, like, there's a million different things going on all the time. And that's what happened to real people in history. They were real. So just to choose one time and just pretend that the world began and ended there didn't feel right. I don't know, Catherine, if you had a thought, a different.
I completely agree. I would say that we decided to look at that layering to allow for sort of the bigger story of the kitchen to be there. That it has been a part of many moments in time. And that we can talk about slavery in terms of the Morrises. We know that they were enslavers. But if we were only looking at the Jumels, we would not look at slavery because they did not own slaves. And so people, they did have indentured servants. And so we could talk about that. So each of those different layers really represents a different part of the historic story of the house. So yeah, that's my feeling as well.
And I think, Catherine, you would say, I have a question for you. I mean,
okay,
I didn't work on interpretation of Anne Northrop because it's not my area, right? But there is, in fact, very good interpretation of Anne Northrop that you all are expertise at, that you have expertise in. And so you handled that. I mean, I handled this side of it because it hasn't really very much been interpreted before now, the life of the enslaved cooks.
not at all.
Yeah.
Now that was very much a part of our thinking, is that we did want to approach that, from the time of it being built, probably through enslaved labor, that had not been talked about in the many decades of interpreting the house. And so we in this reinterpretation, it is to look at those people. We've never really looked at the people who took care of the house and the owners of the house. It's always been really about Eliza, the Morrises, and Washington himself. So I think this is a very different take on the house, looking at it from a different viewpoint. We do have another few questions, so let me try to get to them. So how did you make accommodations for programming from Anne? Thank you for asking that, Anne. I can answer that, Ramin. We had a wall built so that we could hide all of the modern things that we don't want people to see, that we use for programming, like tables, folding tables, and materials that we use in school programs. So we built the false wall so that we could hide that, where before, when you came down into the kitchen, you could see folding chairs and folding tables when you came down into the kitchen. And we had an IKEA cabinet. So now we're able to really, I think, give you a more seamless look at the kitchen by building that false wall and cabinet in it. Then we have another question. What is the most surprising thing you discovered while doing your research on the kitchen? What is the thing you would most like to know about the people who worked in the kitchen? This is from Glenn.
So for me, the most surprising thing, it's kind of very mundane, but was that there was a laundry in the kitchen, because for a house that size, in fact, in our early discussions, I said it's highly unlikely that the laundry is in that kitchen. It's a very big house. It probably would have been a separate room. This is very much the norm. You wouldn't use that valuable space to have a laundry. And then in doing the research, we found out, in fact, it was absolutely in the kitchen. And as I said, there was a pump, there was a well there, it's there, from which they could draw water to boil these big cauldrons to do laundry. So just from my perspective, working in these spaces, that was surprising to me, because they had ample land. They didn't need to have it right there in the building, but it was certainly more convenient. The thing I would like people to know about the people who worked not only in this kitchen, but in kitchens like it, is that their work included not just a high level of skill, but a lot of physical strength. And because it was a very laborious job. The earliest that, the people who got up in the kitchen, the scullions, the scullery maids, and scullions, the young men who worked in the kitchen to start to restart the fires and get water boiling or milk cows and so on, were up at 4:30 in the morning. And the cooks rose soon thereafter, and their work went all the way till 8 o'clock at night. A constant stream of work, doing many different things, timing so much, all these different dishes. If there was a party in the house, it was even more hectic. I think, Thanksgiving is coming up. Think about doing Thanksgiving in your own home, or if you visit somebody, like timing the dishes and all the hubbub, and now explode that onto a much larger scale where the stakes are actually much higher for the people who fail. So that's the thing I would like people to really understand, that this was as hard of a labor as anybody could do. Just because it was inside and in a kitchen and the final product was beautiful and delicious and tasty, doesn't mean it wasn't, brutally hard work.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question from Wayne. His question is, how can the Morris-Jumel Mansion continue to explore the lives of the people who worked in the kitchen and continue to tell their story?
Well, so what I'll tell you, thank you, Wayne, for that question. That's a good question, because the thing is, the work never stops. And I'll give you an example. I was at a repository, I was at a collection in upstate New York, looking entirely for something different in an account ledger. And there was the mansion. It was actually mentioned, and rental income from the owner, who's listed as one of the owners, but actually owned it much longer than was originally thought, which was determined from this ledger. I say that to you to say that the how is to always keep your eyes open and to understand that when you do research, to try, even as you're looking for one thing, to be expansive in your thinking and be open to the fact that something else might come out, right? And things are digitized all the time. People who have private collections, give them to a museum. So the answer, I guess the short answer is, the way to continue to explore is to have a commitment, not to say this kitchen is reinterpreted, the job is over. It's not over. The stories can still, you just have to be willing to continue your research. The person who's my main subject area, I'm pretty much committed to trying to find everything I can about him till the day I die. And I hope somebody continues it after me. So that's kind of my take on that. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but
that's history. That's the study of history. We're always finding out new things, and we're always having to reevaluate what we have said before. And so I think having that mindset with any exhibit in a museum of history is necessary. You have to be open to change, and you can say it's a permanent exhibit, but that doesn't really mean permanent. It should always be
or it shouldn't mean permanent.
Yeah, it should always be open to change. So we will take one more. Can you outline a few typical main meals that would have been prepared, say, one everyday or one special occasion?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question because in this household, or let's say here at Mount Vernon, and I'm making this as an example because Washington was one of the richest men in the country, and the Morrises, the Phillipses were certainly in that category as well. Their typical meals were still better than your sort of average person's typical meals, right? Because they did have these teams of cooks, right, and scullions and so on. But an everyday meal might include certainly a roast of some kind, a joint of meat of some kind, or roasted birds, and so on. Salads were very popular when they were in season, and when they weren't in season, pickled vegetables, very common. Certainly bread would be made daily. There was always a good variety. There'd be cheese, fruits if they were in season, or fruits that could be stored over, like apples, right? So this time of year, apples would have been barreled and stored and so on. And there was actually quite a variety of vegetables prepared a number of ways. I think what would have marked a special occasion would have been a couple of things. The first would be that you'd have much more variety of everything. So on an everyday basis for a family like this, you might have had 3 or 4 vegetable dishes and maybe 2 roasts, right? And 1 pie and a typical meal. And by the way, once that main meal was eaten, everything that was left over was repurposed for breakfast the next day or lunch the next day. It wasn't thrown away. Once that was, so you might have more of it, right, for a special occasion. So you may have many more vegetable dishes. You may have different types of roast animals, right? Not just a chicken or a joint of ham, but beef or wild boar. Fish would have been was very popular because of the proximity of the rivers. Something that you've seen more of on a special occasion, 2 things. One would be gelées, right? So this would be like fruit jellies that were the jelly was made using like a cow foot, right? Or an animal or sheep's foot from which the gelatin would come out of. That's what gelatin powder is made out of. And then used to make very elaborately molded jellies and also elaborate pastries. So something you see is these incredibly ornate pastries, some of which are not actually meant to be eaten. The pastry itself is a container. It's called a coffin, actually, highly decorated for something like stewed meat or like a pot pie or so on. So the quantity and the level of elaborateness of the ingredients is what would mark the two things differently. And also imports, by the way. So a way to show off how rich and important where you are is all the imported food that you could have. Like it's not uncommon in wealthy houses to see a coconut show up, even in the 18th century, right? Because it meant you could bring things in from the Caribbean, chocolate for drinking chocolate and so on.
Oh yeah, we definitely wanted to include the history of chocolate in the exhibit when and it was great when we found that chocolate pot so that we could have that. Well, Ramin, I want to thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge. You are just, it's incredible what you have in your head. Because I was just thinking, like, I work in the mansion, but you have more dates in your head than I do. So, it's a lot. And I also, I really want to thank you for working with us on the project because you made it so much better. And we really very much appreciate that, having your voice in it. And so it's just been a very a wonderful pleasure to work with you on it. So
thank you.
Thank you again. And to everyone else, thank you for attending our virtual parlor chat. We appreciate that. And to everyone who asked a question. And now have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Good night, everybody.